Hello, hello. Hi, hi, hi. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome. Good to see all of you, or to see some of you, I should say, and to know that all of you are here. Hope you guys are doing well this Shabbos morning. We'll start with Birchot Torah. Let's see. Who hasn't made the blessing of the Torah in a while and would like to lead us this morning? Anybody? Show of hands. Let's see. Okay, great. Thank you all for volunteering. Paul, we'd love to have you do it. So Paul Solomon, why don't you unmute yourself? And I'll share the screen so you can see the blessing over the Torah. Can't hear you yet. We can't hear you. Go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, Paul.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen. V'ayev Adonai Eloheinu et direi Toratcha b'finu b'fi amecha b'Yisrael Yisrael. May it be sweet today, sweet always. Sweet to learn some Torah. So let's learn. So Parshat Vayigash really makes no sense unless you know Parshat Miketz, at least the end of Parshat Miketz, meaning like it's certainly, it picks up in the middle of the story. It's such a great story, isn't it? Such a beautiful story. The story of Yosef and his brothers. Such a beautiful story, meaning it's tragic and painful and all the things that, you know, tomes have been written about the Joseph and his brothers. But it's just such a beautiful constructed story, just the literary qualities and the way that it takes you on this journey. And Parshat Vayigash, of course, is the penultimate moment. It begins with something. But let's look back at last week's Parsha and to go forward into this week's Parsha, okay? So, in last week's Parsha, the brothers have been caught, or they are they are the victims of a very subtle and very obvious setup, and so now they've come back from having stayed away. This vizier, this viceroy, this character whom we know as Joseph, has sent him back to bring and said, "You shall not see my face unless you bring back Benjamin." And they wait, and then they finally convince Jacob, which we'll get to a little bit later, and they bring Benjamin back, and Joseph sees them, of course, and then has them brought to his home where they'll dine together with a mid-afternoon meal, and then they send them back with all the grain that they need, and they place the special divining goblet of Joseph into Benjamin's knapsack, into his bag, and then they catch up to him. They barely left the city, and they open their bags, and of course the goblet. They first deny it, and then they say, of course, whoever has the goblet should die. And then they open up their sacks, and they see that there's a goblet. In the goblet that is indeed the stolen goblet is in Benjamin's belongings, and they tear their clothing, they rend their clothing, and they come back before Joseph, and the scene picks up, and someone is speaking to the viceroy and says this. Asher yimatzei ito me'avadecha v'meis, verse 9. Whomever of your servants is found with this goblet shall die. V'gam anachnu, the rest of us, moreover, niyeh lavdo ni lavadim, will become servants, we become avadim. And so Joseph says, no, vayomer, no. Gam ataki divrechem keinu, even though what you're saying is Cain, is true, is right, is just. Asher yimatzei ito yeli levet. Only, we're not involved in collective punishment, he says. Only the one to whom this goblet, right, one who has stolen the goblet, that's the one that will be punished. He will become my servant. Vatem, as for you, to you, niki'im. He says this word, you will be naki, which means to be cleansed. You'll be innocent. It's very strong, too. Of course, just imagine if you are the brothers and you're hearing this, right? They know that the one who has the goblet is also naki, right? They're all nikiim. Nobody stole the goblet. They know. But he says this word, atentu nikiim. And they hurry up and they take their sacks down, right? And just to build the tension, they begin with the eldest one, and then they come to the smallest, the katan. And they find this goblet in. Right? Oh, so I'm sorry, I did put this here. This is exactly where I picked up. Okay, they tear their garments in verse 13. And they reloaded their donkeys, and they go back to the city. Now, verse 14 introduces some hierarchy between the brothers and Judah, right? This is where it begins. Judah has not been separated out from the brothers yet, except in his conversations with Jacob earlier on, where he was the one that convinced Jacob to let Benjamin go. But here, verse 14 begins, which you can't see in the English, but over here on the right side, in the Hebrew, Vayavo Yehuda ve'echav ubeisa Yosef. And Judah and the brothers now return to the house of Joseph. Behu odenu sham. It's a very strange piece of information, and Joseph is waiting. He knew something he was part of it, right? Vayiplu lefanav arza, and now they all fall on their faces before him. Of course, this recounts the dream, of course, right? Now they are as the sheaves back in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev. They have actually fulfilled this dream before him. Vayomer lehem Yosef, and Joseph says to them, Mama says there, what is this thing that you've done? Halo yidatem, didn't you know ki nachesh ish asher kamoni? Didn't you know that someone like me is a diviner? What exactly meant by that? It's very powerful to see the word nachash here. We haven't seen the word nachash since the beginning of the Torah. The word nachash means a serpent. Divination, here in this context, it means to divine, but it's also, I'm sly, I'm serpent-like, I'm tricky. Who knows? Vayomer Yehuda, ma nomar la'adoni. What can we say to our master? What can we speak, and in what way can we be justified? Prove our innocence. Elohim matzat avon avadecha. God has found the sin of your servants. Hinenu avadim ladoni gam anachnu gam asher nimtza agav biyado. So now Judah wants to push back against what the servant. Excuse me, I said it incorrectly before. The servant of Joseph had said, only the one to whom the gaba belongs is innocent, and now Yehuda is is pushing back and saying we all deserve to be your servants. Of course, anyone who's reading this is also hearing a confession, right? That God has found the sin of your servants. Clearly, Judah must know that there's no sin, right? No proximate sin, but the distal sin still is in their hearts and in their minds. And this is also must be taken into account in the coming verses because it's compelling to hear Judah confess for the brothers in this way. He says, we do want a collective punishment. We don't want anyone. Joseph says, no, God forbid, Chalila, God forbid that I should do such a thing. Only ha'isha shenimtza gavia biyado. Only this one. Only the ish. In verse 17, right? Only that one. Hu yeli evid v'atem malu l'shalom el avichem. And the rest of you go back in peace to your father. Now, this is the way Parshat Miketz ends. And Parshat Vayigash will begin in a moment in verse 18. But what a cliffhanger. What an intensification of tension and pressure. Huh? It's beautiful. And not just that. He uses words just literally, right? When Jacob sent Joseph to find the brothers, he went to find the peace of the brothers in Shechem. When if you look back in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, where the whole thing begins, Jacob comes to Joseph and says, go now to Shechem, v'u et shalom achecha b'Shechem. And the word shalom appears over and over again in the story. Right? If you look at the brothers, when they come to see Joseph, he says to them, "Shalom, is it peaceful to your father? Is it peaceful? Is it shalom, shalom?" It's very hard not to read Joseph saying this. The rest of you can go back in peace, right? With more than a tinge of irony, with almost a sting, a bite in this shalom from Joseph to the brothers. In other words, what kind of shalom can you bring to your father when his son Benjamin is not with him? And what kind of peace could you bring back to our father when you came back without me, without Joseph? What kind of peace did he live with for these years? What kind of peace is possible? And he says it, right? As for all the rest of you, go back to the peace that you'll bring to your father. Now this is the setup, of course, for this next pasuk and the power of it. Verse 18. I'm going to come to, just so everybody knows, we're going to do a little bit more, and then we'll do a little text on one of the psukim and in the story, and then I'll open it up for some comments and some questions. Vayigash elav Yehuda, the Torah begins, Vayigash elav Yehuda, Vayomer biyadoni. Vayigash. Now, just to stop for a second on the word Vayigash. It'll come back in a moment when Joseph will reveal himself. The word Vayigash means to approach, to come close. It also has a quality of intimacy, of almost being as close that you can touch the other person. You'll find it in the narrative of Isaac and his blessings to Jacob and Esau. You'll find the word Geshuna. Come close, touch my skin, let me smell you. There's a quality of intimacy that the commentators here, of course, pick up on, that Judah comes very close, almost speaking into the ear of Joseph. And just to see that scene, because, of course, it must be terrifying, right? To think that, what Judah does here is quite remarkable. So he jumps to him. Just parenthetically, I remember that learning that the Gaon of Vilna, the great Elijah of Vilna, wrote that the cantillation over the three words, Vayigash elav Yehuda, the musical notation is called Kadma V'Azla Revi'i. And in Aramaic, it means got up and went the fourth. And it's sung like this. Kadma V'Azla Revi'i. And so you hear that over the three words, and got up and approached the fourth son. Yehuda is the fourth son of Leah, right? So he saw in that a little, kind of a fun note. And he says to him, Bi Adoni, my master, can I speak to you in your ear, and do not be angry with me? After all, you are as strong and as powerful as Paro. He appeases him. And now he reframes the whole story from his own perspective. Adoni shalat avadav more. My master asked his servants, requested, do you have a father or a son? He, of course, changes very important pieces here that we're not going to go into. But that's also part of the way he retells the story, and he tells it in a way that's compelling. Vanomer, we said to Adoni in verse 20, Yeshlanu av zakein, we have an old, infirm, older father, v'yeled zikunim katan, and a child of his old age who was quite young, whose brother died. And then this word, vayivater hu levado. Anyone who reads this knows that this exact phrase only appears one other time in the Torah. Only one other time in the Torah. And that is when Jacob was left alone, all by himself, struggling with that being, right? In Parshat Vayishlach. Vayivaser hu levado li'imo ve'aviv ahevo. He now casts, for the reader, Benjamin is now the one whose life is in peril. He's alone existentially and alone, right, to his mother and is beloved by his father. It also lets us know that part of this problem is still the remnant and the residue of what took place back in chapter 34, I guess it was, Vayishlach. So, or 32. Like part of the continued problem with the brothers is connected to Jacob's own karma that he never completed. Vayivaser hu levado le'imo v'aviv ahevo. V'atomer alavadecha haridu elai v'asima eni alav. And you told your servant, bring him to me that I might put my eye on him. V'nomer al Adoni lo yuchel anar lazov et aviv azav et aviv v'meis. This never happened. They never said to him, right, this part, if we take him down, right, he'll die. No. But he's telling him how much Jacob loves Benjamin, just like he loved Joseph. He says, if you told us, if we don't bring our small brother, he keeps telling him how small he is or how young he is, then we won't tosifun lerot panai. Now that, anybody who reads that in verse 23, you will not see my face any longer, can't but hear the word Joseph in the word tosifun, right? You will no longer see me, right? In other words, if you don't bring Benjamin down, you won't see Joseph. And when we went up to our father, your servant, by the way, the rabbis had a field day with how Judah is saying that his father, Jacob, was the servant of the viceroy. He was punished for that. He says it over and over again. Vayomer Avinu, and our father said, Shuvu shiva ma'at ochel, in verse 25. Our father, Jacob, said, go back and get some food for us. Vanomer lo nuchal leredes im yesh achinu hakaton itanu. And we told him we can't go back if we don't have our young brother with us. V'yaradnu ki lo nuchal leros pnei ish. We can't go back and see the face of this person. V'achinu hakaton einenu itanu. And without our younger brother, einenu itanu, that word einenu, right, is not with us, no longer. And your father, our servant, said, he's saying this all out loud, that I've only had two children, my wife. And one of them went out from me, and I said, Ach Tarov Toraf, and he was surely torn to pieces. I haven't seen him until now. all of this is really intense for, I'm sure, Joseph to hear. First of all, that Judah is saying once again that there was preferential treatment, that Jacob loved Rachel over Leah, and Judah is saying this, and nonetheless he's not angry. And even Jacob saying very insultingly and painfully, I've only had 2 children, and that they had to hear that. And Joseph hears it. And then that he hears that Jacob was still waiting, hoping to see him. I haven't seen him until now. I thought you said he was torn to pieces, but I haven't seen him till now. Which one, torn to pieces or having seen him till now? So clearly Jacob is still waiting to see Joseph. He hasn't given up on it. In verse 29, and you'll take this one from me, and something, God forbid, will happen to him, and you'll bring me to the grave. I'll die. This is it. He's coming up. And now, if we come back to your servant, my father, and the Na'ar, this term Na'ar is so poignant. Joseph was described in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev as V'hunar b'nei Bilha b'nei Zilpa. He was the one who was Na'aring the children of Bilha and Zilpa. He knows that he was the original Na'ar. He was the original innocent child. Einenu, and not with me. V'nafsho kshura b'nafsho, and his soul is so bound with his soul. Vayakir oso ki ein anar v'meis. If he sees, he'll die. And we will become proxy, responsible for fratricide. We'll kill for patricide. We'll kill our father. How can we do that? And this is the verse, maybe the most important verse in the Torah. Your servant has made the Na'ar into his, I've given myself as collateral, arav. The word in Hebrew is arav. I have collateralized myself. I'm sure you studied this with Rabbi Koloresis last week or 2 weeks ago. I've collateralized myself. If I don't bring him to you, I will be in sin all of the days of my life. Now, this doesn't mean that he has to, what he's about to do next, but just to say that he did that. Avdecha arav es hanar, that your servant has made the nar into a collateral. V'ata, verse 33, yeshev na avdecha tachas hanar. May I be in, now the word tachat here is also important, right? I want to be in place of the na'ar, in place of the child. Like in the story of the Akedah, where the first time we see this word tachat, it's the ram becomes the in place of the sacrificial Isaac, right? Tachas. And also later on in notions of ayin, tachas ayin. Tachat, right? Tachat. Ve'ata yeshev navdecha tachat anar eved ladoni. Ve'anar ya'al dimechav. Ki eich eleh. Eich eleh el aviv anar inenu iti. Pen erev arashi imsat avi. Now, Judah says, I can't bear to see the pain that this will cause my father. Now, we could stop there for a moment. I think we know the rest of the story. But it always, each and every year, right, there's more here, right? The whole story, which maybe you'll get a chance to see. Every year, we come on this moment, which is this moment of Avdecha Raves Anar. This whole Judah soliloquy, which of course is one of the most powerful soliloquies in all of Tanakh, and maybe all of Western literature, and what exactly about it, what was so powerful and what was so smart and what was so persuasive. I mean, it's an incredibly persuasive moment, and Judah clearly has that power. But what exactly tips the scales is, of course, this moment where Yehuda says, I have made myself into a surety. I have made myself into a collateral for Benjamin, and I will place myself. And the request that Judah's request to remain alone, right, to remain alone in place of Benjamin, whether he was afraid that Benjamin wouldn't be able to handle it, as some of the commentators say, whatever it is, it seems also that he's motivated by a deep empathy for his father Jacob. And it seems remarkable, right, that this moment, right, this moment is a moment of great pathos, a moment where, in some sense, Joseph, if he was testing the brothers, let's say in the theory that Joseph was testing the brothers and setting up the perfect experiment to see if they would actually do again what they had done before. And all of his manipulation was for the sake of seeing if they had done what's called tshuva gemura, like repentance that was from the heart, and it was that they had completely transformed and they were new people, right? And he wanted to see if he could trust them. And he sets up an experiment, and here it is, this moment, and Judah succeeds. Because the experiment was to see, would they be willing to take one of the children of Rachel who was worthy of their jealousy, whatever it might be. And Judah shows that even though that sentiment still exists within the family, that there are only two real children and only one real wife, we're still one unit now. And I would never allow this to happen to my father because I love my father. I will let him go through the same thing again. Maybe that's the theory, and maybe this was the moment, and he says, and he tells them that, and then of course he puts himself in his place, right? Maybe Joseph says, okay, if he would do that now, maybe he would have done that before. He would have stood in when the brothers wanted to kill me, and he would have said, throw me into the pit, right? Instead of Joseph. Or maybe at this moment, Joseph realizes that even though he wanted to punish, right, the brothers and his father, because he thought that maybe they were all in on it, and Benjamin needed to be saved, and Benjamin was going to stay alone with him, and he would take care of him. There's that theory. Something in him realized that he was a new man, and he had power, and that the brothers had indeed transformed, and they had done tshuva, and it would be worth it to try to be with them again and to make it work. And something about Judah's, speech changed him. Whatever it is, it's certainly the case that the very last words that Judah presents before Joseph's great reveal are the words of his own, right, his own guilt and his own responsibility for his brother and for his father's well-being. We're going to stop there. We're going to see in a moment, after we take some comments from everybody, where Rashi will go with this and hearken it back to an earlier moment in Judah's life, and then we'll see a Torah from the Mea Shiloach, the great Hasidic Rebbe, on this Judah moment. So let's go to the hands in the air. Nehemiah, Ilana. Go ahead, Nehemiah.
I speak later.
Ilana, go ahead.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom.
That's a lot.
I think that question of like what is a teshuva gadol, and like what is the nature of a big apology and a big kind of coming around. I was really interested to read this because on a word that a group that I'm part of with this question came up of like, how do you know, or what do you do when a harm has been caused to kind of repair it? And are there opportunities for repair, and what's the model for that? And like, sort of later as we get through it, is Judah's, I think that what you just said of taking responsibility, showing his remorse and showing care, is it because he understood what like really in that place that allows for what comes next? Or like, is that a model for apology or for accountability, for remorsefulness, for turning? I'm sort of just curious about that.
There was an amazing book written a number of years ago by I forgot her name. It became a New York Times bestseller. I think it was on it was called Being Wrong or Just Wrong. It's like there was like a big arrow with the missing the mark. It was like a philosophical inquiry into error and repair and questions of these questions of forgiveness and what's forgivable and what isn't forgivable and how do you know. And I think to a certain degree, the notion that something will never happen again is not a defensible position vis-a-vis wrongdoing. I mean, obviously within reason, right? There are certain things that are, you know, obviously certain crimes and certain things that are done wrong. We of course expect that it'll never happen again. But within the realm of the interpersonal, that things that are not criminal and things that are kind of when people make mistakes or people hurt, like it's clearly an act of great trust to trust someone again. I think it's a big deal, and at best we look for clues, right? There's no guarantee in any of this. At best we like to see clues that work has been done and significant work has been done and the person has made significant strides and efforts. And the rabbis place a great onus on people to forgive, right? It's not as though, like, again, there are things that are clearly people forgive on their own timeline. But if a person has done the kind of work, let's say that Judah represents here, who has been, as we said last night in the shul, he was carved out by his own suffering, which we'll get to a little later, and his own pain and his own life story. And for all intents and purposes, in the narrative, only the readers know that Joseph is the viceroy is Joseph. And so you have a perfect, candid camera going on. This is like the Torah's version of candid camera, right? We're looking in on the psyche of a group of people who the text tells us that the first moment that when the money was placed, not when the goblet, but when the money was placed in their grain bags, they said, "Oh, this is karma. It's because of what we did to Joseph," right? They're carrying it with them, and clearly, right? We don't really know how complete is their inner tshuva. Nobody ever knows that, but certainly, I think that this is a great example of somebody who has come to a moment and has done everything that should be required for forgiveness to take place. And the text wants us to know that Joseph didn't withhold that. He could have withheld it. He could have held a grudge. He had every right to hold it, right? And maybe because he was so wealthy and powerful, maybe he also had the latitude to take a chance in a way that maybe if he were, in a different position, he might not be able to take that chance, maybe. But I don't know. That's what I'm thinking. What do you think?
No, I think I mean I definitely generally find myself in that, and I think there's something about some idea of an authentic apology, right? That it's not to the person. There's no relieving of guilt. That it's coming from like this is something they carried an opportunity and owning it. And I mean I like that model. I definitely really like that in the interpersonal sense. And I'm curious. I mean, we haven't gone to yet, but like, what is the thing for Joseph that makes it enough? Like what happens internally to him that there's this acceptance of that, and that it turns him, and I mean, I think we haven't gotten there yet, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think that we did get there, but I think we'll go deeper in it in a moment. But I think that I personally think it is, of course, the retelling of the story and the recasting of the story also gives Joseph a chance to realize that I think just the great reveal, but I think that the way that Judah recast the story places a great onus on Joseph also to reveal himself. It's not just forgiveness for the sake of the brothers. Joseph's revelation is not only about forgiving the brothers, it's about the withholding of the information of who he is also is causing his father great pain, right? And of course, the great Midrashic question for everyone in the Midrashim, and how could Joseph not tell? He was a viceroy now for quite a while. He had power. He could have told his father that he was, And so that does lend itself to the theory that Joseph was angry at his father too, right? And how could you send me to the brothers? They hate me, and you tell me to go down and see their peace. What kind of peace could I find with the brothers? I mean, goodness gracious. That's also in the stinging way that Judah retold the story. You told us to go back and find the peace of our father. But I think also that Joseph's revelation is a combination of tshuva gemura, like this complete tshuva, and the recognition of what his absence meant, almost like in a Huck Finn sense, or in a kind of It's a Wonderful Life sense. Like, what is his presence meant to his father might not have been as clear to him. And when he hears this, it's like, enough's enough. Now, I think that ultimately we have to ask ourselves the question, Joseph doesn't ever really receive an apology from the brothers about what they did to him, right? The text doesn't clearly say, like, oh, we're so sorry. So something about the way this plays out, right, is powerful, and something about maybe this model of forgiveness maybe doesn't need a direct apology. Like their behavior speaks volumes here, and maybe they owned their mistake, but they didn't own it in the most direct way. But we would prefer maybe a very direct ownership of responsibility by all parties. Okay, Yeshikoch, Marilyn in Montreal, our Rebbe in Montreal, the Holy Marilyn on the mountain.
There we go. Good Shabbos. I had this thought as I was falling asleep last night, Vayigash Elav, and echoes of Lech Lecha. So in Lech Lecha, Abraham is leaving, and there's the Lecha. He's going to himself, and I sort of wanted to do a little trip on V'yigash Elav, that Yehuda is going into himself, and what makes this whole scene so, not going, but approaching, going up to himself. And again, like instead of leaving his family, etc., he's going into himself so deeply that this allows for the transformation. And today I was just very struck by what you just mentioned in the reading, that the brothers do not apologize. As a matter of fact, the brothers really don't do anything. It is Judah going so deeply into himself, and even redeeming his brothers at that in the speech. Part of it is, okay, my brothers, the reason they're not doing what I'm doing is because blah blah blah, so you can just forgive them too, because he redeems everyone.
Yes.
And that message that one person,
Yes.
that one strong act like that can redeem everyone.
In the tradition that Yehuda and Yosef become the ancestors of two messianic lineages. In our tradition, there are two lineages. There's the Messiah, son of David, which is the Judah line, and the Messiah, son of Joseph, is the Joseph line. So there's this moment between Judah and Joseph in the mystical literature of the Zohar, the Kabbalah, the Ari, and then the Chassidus. It's a lot. These two streams coming together represent the redemption of the material world and the spiritual world. It's allegorized as such, and they become historical figures, part of the historical vision of the eschaton, of the end of days. So it's clear to say that Judah is, of course, a redeemer for all of the brothers, because in some sense, this entire story is a story of the two future leadership, right? The two kingdoms of Judah and Joseph, and so on. So it's very much representational of leaders, but we don't know exactly what makes Judah unique and why Judah of all the brothers and why not someone else. And it's a funny question, because obviously the text is being written from the perspective of some historical realities on the ground that have already emerged, right? So Judah is already a leader, so it's not hard to write him in as the leader in the story and give that current historical fact an earlier textual, context or source. But it's certain that that in the Zohar, for example, this entire conversation is between the divine. In Judah speaking, Bi Adoni, it's like inside of me is Adonai, Aleph Dalet Nun Yud, and also inside of me is, of course, Yud He Vav He, because Yehuda's name is all God's name except for that little Dalet. And so they make a field day of this kind of intra-psychic conversation between Judah and different parts of himself and the soul of this, individual, and it becomes a very cosmic conversation. For our purposes, it's clear that when a leader steps up and includes others, either he was doing it to save them because they hadn't done it themselves, or he's been doing it to speak for them on their behalf, on part of their what they could not have said for themselves for all kinds of reasons. And that he had that voice, but that he included them in a powerful way also was maybe moving to Joseph, that he saw that in Judah and all the brothers there was an ethos of collective connection that was powerful. Maybe. All of that before we go to our beloved Ilana. Thank you, Marilyn of Montreal.
Boker Tov. So I'm just so moved by the word witness, by this moment of witness in this pasuk. And first, I just want to reference the class that I was in with Aviva Zornberg this week, where she talks about a kind of incomplete process with Joseph and his brothers because he is never witnessed in his trauma. He doesn't talk about what happened to him. So I'm thinking, though, about this moment with Yehuda, where Yehuda brings up the topic of trauma, his father's trauma. And in that sense, we could view it as a kind of opening up, of a kind of witnessing that, yes, there has been trauma here, that his father has suffered, and it maybe opens up Yosef's ability to be in connection with his own trauma. And also, Yehuda brings up the topic of responsibility, which, hangs so heavy in the air, and might also just be a kind of dissociative block, for Yosef. So as Yosef hears that he was mourned, and that his suffering had some effect on someone else in the world, that it seems to open his heart. And maybe indeed, as you suggested, Rabbi David, one possibility was that he was going to continue to inflict the suffering that he had experienced on his brothers. But he has this opening where he is able to heal by choosing another way because he is being witnessed in some sense.
I think that it's very beautiful. It's very, very beautiful. That the disbelief often that people who suffer trauma, the first moment of disassociation, of course, is this isn't happening, or this can't be happening, or it's my fault. It's happening. And when Judah steps forward and names the pain and takes responsibility, right, for the pain, it's an opening for Joseph, as you said, I think, to feel the reality of what took place in a way, and to cut that reactive pattern, and in that way, ironically, of course, those who are the perpetrators here are also the ones who ironically become the healers. They're the ones who open the door, right? Being able to have the courage to stand in it and own what they did and its impact, right, gives Joseph a chance to feel again. He comes out of being frozen. It's kind of interesting to think of him in that way as either, fighting or fleeing, but now he's feeling and he cries. So it's a very powerful moment. So thank you. It's very touching. I think the witnessing of someone else's pain and is part of the beginning of healing and trauma, and it's really powerful. Thank you. So, friends, we have about 15 minutes, so I'll call on the remaining three people, but then I'll close it. Aluma and then Asher Chaim.
Hi. I really want to piggyback a little bit on what both Marilyn and Alana had said. And I'm definitely reminded, and I think you brought this up in the beginning, of Joseph saying, "You will not see my face again unless you bring your brother." And this scene of Joseph's face is his innermost point, his innermost being. Even though he's super complicated and full of trauma and revenge and guilt, the fact that Judah approaches and Judah comes to that true essence of his inner point, of that Yud point, Joseph is able to open from one Yud to the other Yud. So Joseph's face is able to be revealed because Yehuda revealed himself. And so it's like double revelation here. And then there's the revelation that happens in between Judah and his brother. So there's the inner revelation between each of them, and then the presence that exists between them once this revelation has happened.
That's beautiful too. I think that's a prerequisite for this reconciliation, is that in some way Judah has shown himself to be over and over again the one who's able to be revealed and to reveal himself. And his own vulnerability is what triggers its own yud, his own point of smallness, which is also his point of power, is what also reminds Joseph of his own power too, and his power, the great power in being true and being open. It's very beautiful, and I love that. That's great. All right, Asher Chaim and then Nehemiah. Asher Chaim.
Thank you, Kvod Harav, for triggering this avalanche of questions in my head that I'd love to share because I have no answer. The keyword vayivater, the Leitwort, the intertextuality. I realized that when Jacob is vayivater Yaakov levado, he's about to confront his brother. He fears that his brother will kill him, and he's not sure if his father can still protect him in any way, because his father is the one who preferred his brother, but his father is the one who did give him a real blessing just before he left. And all of this ambiguity and ambivalence, what is my relationship to my father? And then we fast forward to Joseph and his father's love for Benjamin, but also his father's grief, thinking that Yosef was indeed torn apart. And the father loves Benjamin, and the father can't protect Benjamin from Joseph. And did Joseph think that his father had turned against him by sending him off to his brothers? But on the other hand, there was all of the love from before that, the coat of colors. So the uncertainty of this son not knowing how much his father loved him, how much his father could protect him, weaves all of this together, and I have no idea what to do with it. But I thank you so much for questions that are better than any answers I have so far. Bibarfi.
Yeah, Shamati, I think that when we talked about the Jacob being alone, we quoted Rabbi Shmuel Klissner from Jerusalem, who has a book called Wrestling Jacob. And in that book, he notes that the word vayivater, as it's written both in Parsha Vayishlach and as it's written here, which means to be left alone, is written with a vav, but there's a homonym of it with a bet, which means to split. And it appears in the Abraham story where he splits the covenant of the pieces. Brit ben habetarim, the covenant between pieces. And clearly, Rabbi Klissner, Shmuel Klissner's reading is that Jacob, of course, is split. It's not just, it might be a homonym, but it's not, it's also meaningfully connected in its resonance with being split alone. And I think that would be the case also for Jacob here with his brother, with his split mind between, Joseph and Benjamin being separated, or there only being one. There's a split between the brothers, and now there'll be another split happening, with Benjamin being taken and kept. And there's a lot there, and I think that it's very beautiful that the text brings us back there. This is clearly a moment of great transformation, archetypally and spiritually for all of the characters. Certainly, Benjamin seeing his brother Joseph and the two of them crying together is an image of great release and great relief. And I thank you for that, Nehemiah. Go ahead, Nehemiah.
Can you hear me?
Ken, please be brief, Nehemiah. Go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Yishar Koach for everyone before me, including Roberta in her beautiful blog. Joseph is not just a brother. His main role is the teacher. He did his final test when he ran away from the wife of Potiphar and watched the vision of his father to do that, and then when he hit bottom in the dungeon. So he teaches them as a master, and he does everything in total attunement to the flow of energy that brings them to as high as it can reach. And of course, Judah reached so high, he didn't become realized, but he reached so high because he had still downfalls, so high that he does what you said. So Joseph, and the last thing is Yigash. Yigash is also connected to Magash HaKesef. Judah offered himself on the Magash as a sacrifice to uplift everyone. I couldn't be more proud of my name, Bar Yehuda, than today.
Okay, fair. Let's look at the story of Judah a little bit, and then we'll come in for a landing. So, in the text, when if we want to understand the word eravon, which means to be collateralized, and I think we did a deep dive on it. But if you go back to chapter 38 and the story of Tamar and Judah, Tamar, who of course is like, again, Judah has the good fortune of being someone who meets those who hide their identity. Vayomer maha eravon asher eten lach. He says to Tamar, who asks for a collateral, right? How do I know, right? He says, I have no money to pay you. Judah says to this woman, and so he says to her, what can I give you as a pledge? And so he gives her a pledge. But the word, of course, that's the appearance of it in the Judah story. I'll give you that pledge. And of course, that pledge comes back to be the evidence of what he's done, and so he has to own it. In other words, we are interwoven. I can't run from the responsibility of my actions. The eravon here is a marker of the consequences of somebody's behavior in the past, right? I owe it. It's an IOU, right? An eravon, and we're connected. The word, of course, also means to be interwoven with each other. The word erev, like the evening, where evening is made up of light and dark. We are woven together. We are we're connected in a deep connection, a deep bind. And then, of course, it comes up again at the end, the very thing that Judah uses in the speech this morning, right, where he says, Avdecha aravat anar, I became collateral. That's, of course, what he said to his father in chapter 43 last week. Anochi ervenu. I will become an eravon. I'm the eravon, right, for him. I'm the collateral. Miyadi tivakshanu. And from my hand you should request him if I don't bring him to you. And I will be chatati lecha kol hayamim. I will sin before you all of the days of my life. Now, Rashi in the 11th century, quoting the rabbis, say that when Judah told Joseph that I am the collateral, he says, he puts in the mouth of Judah, if you were to ask me, why lama ani nichnas letagar yoter mishar achai? Why have I entered? Why did I step forward more than any of the other brothers? The question that everybody wants to know. Hem kulam mibachutz. They are all on the outside. V'ani nitkasharti b'kesher chazak. And I have tied myself with a strong tie. That's the word. I have become, right? The same words are used about Judah's collateralizing himself to Benjamin as were used in the connection between Jacob and Benjamin. Nafsho kshura benafsho. His soul is tied, bound with his soul. He says, I basically am I'm the belay. Like he's up there. I'm gonna put him up there. But if he goes, I'll go instead of him. Right? I'm his anchor. I'm tied to him. Where he goes, I go. Right? And we're interwoven. We can't be separated. He says, I even gave away lios menude bebeis olamos. He says this is kind of a rabbinic, introduction or in construction and something new, that I gave away my world to come. I gave away this world and the world to come. I was willing to give everything that I had for the sake of Benjamin. I gave both worlds. Now, this notion of being accountable becomes, right, it's actually the term used in Jewish literature for the interwoven nature of our connection with one another as Jews and as parts of the human family. This notion of arevut, collateral, responsibility. The phrase in the Gemara is, Kol Yisrael arevim ze laze ze baze. We are accountable one for another. And this has multiple legal consequences and multiple expressions of Jewish law, of what's called arivut, that we're responsible for one another. We have to step in to be a good Samaritan, like we are interwoven. As one goes, so goes so many of us. So I wanted to read this little piece from the Mea Shiloach, the great 19th century radical Hasidic thinker on this parsha. And then we'll come in for a landing on Judah. This will be for you, Nehemiah. Hinei ze kochan akoach nasan Hashem yitbarach b'shevet Yehuda. He says God has given the tribe of Judah a power, a faculty. She'eno miyaesh atzmo le'olam. Av ki yiresh yavor alav ma. He says that there's something about Judah, and again, we look for it in the text of the sources. Maybe it's because of Leah, who knows? But like he never gives up. Judah is the quality in every human being that never gives up, never ever throws in the towel, never surrenders. Hinei parsha kodemes amar hinenu avadim ladoni. He says in the previous parsha, in Parshat Miketz, he said to Joseph, "We will become servants to our master." It seems as though he was giving up on himself. Right? It seemed as though at that moment he had given up on his own pledge to be the sole responsible one for the sake of Benjamin in both worlds. Like he was willing to have everybody become servants. V'zot parsha, he says, hitchazek asmo ma'od lifnei Hashem yitbarach. In this week's parsha, the Judah point in all of us strengthens itself before the Holy One, and says, "She'av she'asiti shelo kehogei mikol makom yesh yicholos b'yad Hashem yitbarach l'hoshia li." He says, Judah says, even though I made a mistake, God strengthened me to apologize, to make amends. Don't let me give up on myself, on my ability to fix what I've broken and to do what I said I was going to do. He says that's the meaning of the three words. And Judah approached him. Elav, this is very much in line with Aluma. Hainu b'ma'amkei libo shel Yosef. It says, where did Judah go? Judah went into the deepest part of Joseph's heart, in his psychic connection with him. And he said he went straight to the heart of Joseph, and he said, "Don't you give up on me." I came here to apologize and to confess. Open a little place for me to apologize. Open. I can't apologize if you don't. I have to go to the deepest place in your heart. I have to bypass surgery. To bypass your closed heart, your traumatized heart, your untrusting, your anger. Make a space for me. I've come to confess. He did it in the ma'amke libo shel Yosef, in the deepest heart, in the depths, his innermost place. It says, "Kikol hapsukim halalu ta'anei geshes baruch." All of these verses, he says, are a big complaint against God, the Holy One. And Judah was thinking to himself that he was before some melech, some king, some foreign king, fighting with him. And then he says, and then God sent a salvation. And then they saw, they said, and God made it clear, all of a sudden everything was a mirage. They realized that all of their moments of fear, even if they felt real, were like an illusion. It was all it was all made up. And at the whole time they were standing before their brother. He says that's the truth. He says in the future too. He says Hayinu kecholmim. He also connects it to and we'll look back at this whole world of Maya, of illusion. We'll say, wow, we were always in the presence of the Divine One, always in the presence of love. But he ends this moment by introducing a very mystical interpretation of why Judah. And he doesn't really say why. He says it was grace. Why was Judah given this koach, this strength? I don't know. It's Judah. But the most beautiful thing about the Zohar and the mystical teachings of our Torah is that every human being has a little bit of Judah in them. And the Judah in each and every one of us, like the Judah here that was graced by God, to gird himself and say, don't give up on yourself. You made a commitment. You made a commitment. You said you were going to come and take ownership of it. Don't back out. And he went and pleaded with Joseph to open a space for him to do what he had originally planned, which was to show his realization that all of them were one body, one family, one brotherhood, sisterhood, one community, and that he knew that in his being, and that he came to confess to him. And that strength, right, that strength of approaching the depths of Joseph's heart was what opened the door for Judah and for the brothers and for the story's happy ending. Anyway, that's the Torah this morning. I feel it deeply, you know. I live as a rabbi in a community that maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't know. There have been people in the past who were frustrated with me or angry with me, things that I did in the past that I regret as a rabbi. There's no rabbi that's perfect. There's no leader that's perfect. Joseph, you know, is not the one making amends, but Judah is a leader amongst the brothers. And I don't know if there's, you know, there's some people who meet now who are not a part of the Romemu community, who used to be very, very deeply involved in the Romemu community. They sometimes meet very close by, and I get wind of it, and it breaks my heart every time. And I say to myself, I wish that they'd come back. What would it take? What would it take to speak to the heart of the deepest place in Joseph and say, I'm sorry, I made mistakes. I wish I could do things differently. We've all been through so much the last couple of years. All of us have been carved. We've been broken. We realize the folly of some of the things that we thought were so important before, and now we see differently. And so I don't know if there's anybody out there now, or anybody out there soon. Vayigash elav Yehuda, medaber ma'amkei libi, el ma'amkei libchem. You know, I don't give up, and I'm not giving up on myself either. I made a promise, and I keep my promises. And there's nothing that I can hear about myself that I've done that isn't the best David that will be a surprise to me. I know my shadow pretty well. I hope that God should give me the blessing to bring as much light as possible into places that I haven't been able to reach and speak to in people, so that I can do tshuva. That's what I want more than anything. You know, my name is David. So I'm from that lineage of Yehuda, the lineage of what the Talmud says, that they're from the family of Bali Tshuva. I should be blessed to say about myself, and maybe all of us should be blessed to say about ourselves, that we are real emistic Bali Tshuvas, that we know how to return. So have a great Shabbos, everybody. In any which way